So thank you for coming. Turned on. Okay, you hear me better. So welcome again at Startup Grind. Startup Grind started back in Palo Alto, in the heart of Silicon Valley, more than 10 years ago. Now we're hosting thousands of events every month around the globe. Our flagship event is happening actually in April. It's a global conference. And in a minute, I will show you what it's all about. But for tonight, we have an amazing venue, an amazing speaker, and the moderator. But first thing first, I just wanted to share with you the values of Startup Grind as a community. We help others, we give first. We are all about education, making friends, not just contacts, making connections, and finding inspiration. Here's the team. If you see them around, just you can ask questions about the next event or just about anything on startups. So our next event is a mentor office hours. It will happen at Zendesk office on 29th of March. So you could basically go on this link and have access to one-on-one mentorship from legal teams, from customer support, sales, finding developers, and so on. So this is the global conference happening in April. It's in the Silicon Valley. A couple of speakers. You can go online and also register and visit the global conference. So for tonight, I just want to say thank you to our partners, Paddle, for hosting us tonight, for providing the food, drinks, and nice office. Supreme Factory. Also Louis Silken. If you're looking for legal advice, that's a great firm to go, we recommend. And Index.dev, if you're looking to hire remote developers, Index people are here. So if you're looking to hire somebody to develop a ChatGPT app or a Ruby developer, here you have it. So for tonight we have Christian, the founder of Paddle, and Maria, who is a general partner, Kindred Capital. I will let them introduce themselves and tell about the stories and how they got to know each other and how Paddle was created. I find this story fascinating. One more time, thank you, Paddle. I think your one-to-go SaaS solution when you're looking for payments as a startup should be Paddle. It's a great company, and I'm really honored and fascinated to hear the story of the company. So let's give a warm welcome, like really a rock star welcome to our speaker and Maria, our moderator for tonight. So.
You? Me. Maybe just go with the handheld one.
Is this working? If I turn it on, it kind of makes a... Yeah? No?
No.
Yes? Can you guys hear the mic? Yeah. Great. Let's check your mic and then we'll do proper...
Mine on? Am I good?
Yeah?
Yes? No? Thumbs up? Someone?
Thumbs up? Is he on?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Cool.
So just a quick introduction. I'm Maria Palma. I'm a general partner at Kindred Capital, as was mentioned prior. We are a seed and pre-seed fund. We invest all over Europe. We do a few things a little bit differently, one of which is that we share carry with our founders. So we invest in Paddle, and then Christian also shares in the upside of the other companies in our fund as part of what we do. But we are not here to talk about me and or Kindred. We just happen to be an investor in Christian and the wonderful Paddle. So let's back up. I think not everyone probably knows the founding story. How did you get out of your A-levels to found a company? And did you found a company to get out of your A-levels?
I think it depends on who you ask. So I discovered the internet when I was very young, kind of became a little bit obsessed with it at age 12 or 13, started building websites for people in the town I grew up in. And I was thinking, I looked at your list of questions the other day, kind of just before this, or kind of some topics you wanted to cover. And you mentioned like the first like restaurant that I built this website for.
Dynasty.
Yeah, Bombay Dynasty,
Yeah.
or Dynasty, which was an Indian restaurant in the town I grew up in. And sort of, I think like one of your questions was sort of, you must get a lot of no. And like, actually the secret to not getting any no's was I was just really interested in just building these websites. I didn't actually care about getting paid. So I'd build them first, and then I would like knock on the door of the restaurant or the business and then try and sell them the thing that I'd already built. So it was relatively high conversion, not necessarily high price point. I lost all leverage.
But also, they knew you could deliver, right?
Yeah,
it was already
exactly.
there. It's like, I've made it. Do you want to pay
It's
for
like
it?
the opposite of usually hiring an agency to do something. So I did that. I was kind of building websites for people when I was like a 13-year-old kid. Clearly had lots of friends, but super social. And at some point in that, after making a website for somebody and then asking them for the money, someone asked for like an invoice or a receipt. And I had no idea what an invoice or a receipt was. So I kind of went home and Googled it, and QuickBooks or Xero or something came up, and it was like £10 a month. And I was like, screw this, I'm not paying £10 a month, I can build it. So I started building invoicing software at about 14.
Just your usual 14-year-old habit.
Exactly. And then found it way more interesting building a product that solved a problem than transcribing another menu. Shocker. And then realized I wasn't building these websites anymore, so it wasn't sort of kind of almost blackmailing these businesses into giving me their money for the website I built for them. And instead started selling this invoicing software. And kind of that was, I was 14-ish. And that was the first software company. And it was,
Let's just pause on that for a second, because that first iteration, if I recall history correctly, you actually had like real users and real revenue. What did that look like in the early days?
Yeah, so that business scaled to about 5 million in revenue in 18 months.
Yeah, so you're making 5 million revenue when you're like 15.
Yeah, like 15 and a half, 16.
Yeah, what does a 15-year-old do when they have 5 million revenue? Are you just investing in the business? Are you buying a car? Like, what are you doing?
It was basically all plowed back into the business and marketing and things like that. I had no real interest in buying stuff. I still don't really have interest in buying stuff. But yeah, it was all like kind of, as soon as I latched onto a thing that was working, it became immediately like, sort of like Intuit makes QuickBooks, how do I make this bigger than them? Like kind of, that became the goal, or Xero, or kind of whomever it was.
And actually, I just want to double click on that for a second. What made you want to make it bigger? Because I think you were inspired by Groupon, but it wasn't probably, where is the hometown you are from?
It's a town called Corby in Northamptonshire.
Yeah, so it's probably not super common for a 14-year-old in Corby to be like looking at this US startup ecosystem. How did you get into that?
I don't really know. I'd always been fascinated with how stuff works.
Yeah.
And initially it was how technology things worked. Like, how do you build something, or like disassembling, much to the dismay of my parents and grandparents, like the DVD player or something, without them knowing, and trying to figure out how it works. So it was always like a desire to figure out how something worked, even if that was a completely misguided thing of trying to disassemble home appliances. And then like that then started applying to websites. So I kind of decided I wanted to build a website because I went to a website and I was like, how does this thing work? And then the same thing applied to software. It was like, okay, how does software work? How is that different from a website? They're both on a computer. Like, how do I make this thing like more functional or interactive? And then kind of it went to like selling that piece of software. And then it was sort of like, oh, a business is just like another machine. It just has different components, and the components are like money and people and kind of strategy and things like that. So I think it started with the desire of like almost just dismantling a business and being like, what are the component pieces of this that is made up from? What are the things that kind of the components that you have to add or like get bigger, or any of these things in order for, so I kind of just saw a business as another like machine or object to be sort of dismantled and put back together. And then it became like, the desire was like, well, oh, if these machines work when they're really small, they also work when they're really big. And actually, to 15-year-old me, there was absolutely zero difference between the very, very small business and the very, very big one, other than the big one happened to be big. So then it was a case of like, okay, how do you make the small thing into the big thing? And let's basically what I've been doing for the last 10, 15 years.
And doing it with multiple iterations. But before we get there, so when did you decide, because you had revenue that you invested back in, which is a bit unique, right? I think we've been in a phase where a lot of companies have grown businesses and not necessarily monetized, but we can come back to that. When did you decide to raise, and what made you say, okay, I want to turn this into a venture business versus just a business?
So it actually I got that business to like 5-6 million in revenue, maybe a little bit north of that. I was like 17 as like we were growing and started building a team and things like that. And actually then it became sort of actually one of those components of business that was actually really difficult was how do we sell this stuff? Like, we have all these people who want to buy it, but they're in every different country, they want to pay in every different currency and payment method, and then there have to be taxes in all those places, and like that was really difficult. And it felt weirdly kind of bureaucratic, and I kind of just wanted a solution to that problem. Like I was super interested in just building this piece of software and scaling the business. And it came to that problem, and it was like, this is the days pre like Adyen and Stripe and kind of things like that. It was a couple of years before they were founded. So like the process of like getting an account to take money, credit card payments over the internet was you go and find a local bank or whatever, you go into the branch, you fill in a bunch of forms. That's really difficult as well when you're like this big and can't legally sign any of the paperwork. So you have to go in with your parents to do it. So there were all of these barriers, and then sort of kind of got through all of those, and then 18 months after that, I think we wanted to start taking it in a different currency or in a different country or something like that, and it was the same process again. And it was like, here are all these fees, and here are all this setup costs, and sort of all of these things, and I was like, there must be a better like iteration of this that exists. Like, if you think about that form that you're filling out, it's the same form that people were filling out like 30 years earlier when they wanted to take credit cards with those weird little kind of machines that you used to get in hotels where it like stamped over the card. Like it's the same form. So I just started emailing kind of other people who were running software companies and be like, what do you guys do? Like kind of people that, usually I was just a customer of their product and I paid for it and I used it, and I was like, how do you guys solve this problem? Because I'm finding it really difficult. And it was less so that it was difficult, it was more so that it was a massive time suck of all of the things that I didn't want to be spending time on, because I would rather build the product or hire people or do any of these things. And it was like the first instance in which I remember that it's actually really easy to get people to talk about something they hate. Like I would send these cold emails, I get like a 90% reply rate with like 8 paragraphs of like kind of, it was like a little therapy session for them. Of all of these things that they didn't like about their business. And then I was like, why has nobody done any of this stuff?
Turns out nobody wants the administrative burden of like all the countries and all the VAT tax. People don't get up for VAT tax.
So I was entirely naive to all of that. And I was just like, screw it. Like I hired somebody to run that business. I moved to London when I turned 18, moved to London to start Paddle.
You had a deal with your parents, right, at that point? Or
I had a deal with my parents a little bit earlier than that. Yeah. So when I was 16, I dropped out of school, and the deal with my parents was when I was like 15, because I would come home every day and ask them, like, hey, can I drop out of school? I hate it. It was, I can't remember exactly the things. It's like, one, you had to get all A's in kind of whatever the subjects were. And two, like, because I was making these websites and things for people, it was, you have to, it was make like £100,000 or something. Kind of some ridiculous amount of money that I definitely wasn't going to hit, because they wanted to be like, we want to encourage him to do this thing, but we still want him to kind of continue in school. So I think I did relatively well in all the grades. I can't actually remember what I got, but I did relatively well in all the grades, and I ended up making like 500 grand because it was like the first 6 months of this business that it kind of like blew up. And so I satisfied both of those requirements, and they begrudgingly let me kind of quit school when I was 16, then continued scaling that business, then ran into this problem, and then eventually kind of moved out.
So you come to London. So Mark Evans, one of our partners who was the first, was in this first round. We've actually, ironically, at Kindred, we have 2 people who've invested in Paddle at different moments in time, because someone invested in another fund and then came to our fund. But you know, the first conversation with Mark, like you're 17 or 18 at this point, you've first time pitching a VC, like how did that conversation go down? How did it go talking to different people, Mark and or otherwise? And,
this may be my favorite story from Paddle, mostly because I've said it in a lot of like talks, but I don't think I've ever said it in an environment where it wasn't like Chatham House rules and recorded. But screw it. So I moved to London. We had raised like £50,000 from a guy who he founded a business called My Voucher Codes. He later started a fund called Thiel Ventures. Great guy. We moved into his office. He kind of like seeded us with the business. And really the goal behind raising money, like for the first time, was I built a business. I've never built a company. Mm-hmm. Like I've built software and then managed to sell it and be kind of relatively successful doing that. I've never actually built a thing to scale. Like I've never hired a leadership team or run a board meeting or done any of these things. So it was a case of like, I want somebody who's done that. So found the guy, met him on Twitter. Actually took the trip up to London initially with my dad because my parents wouldn't let me come to London on my own. This was like kind of 6 months before I moved. Met this guy called Mark. He agreed basically on the spot to give me 150K, which I thought was ridiculous. I was just like, and then moved to London and then met the second Mark Evans, and was introduced to Mark through a guy called Harry Briggs, who also ended up investing in Paddle actually later down the line. Was introduced to Mark. I had one sit-down meeting with Mark in the other Mark's office, very confusing. And sort of he was like, why don't you come? He was at a fund called Boulderton at the time. Why don't you come to Boulderton? And we have this thing. And I had no idea what venture capital was. And he was like, we do this thing. It's like a Monday morning meeting. And I was like, oh, that's very structured. Like Monday morning meeting. That sounds not ominous at all. And I went into this Monday morning meeting, and it's the whole partnership of Boulderton sitting around this table, of which it's like 14 people, 13 people, something, and kind of all the investing partners and things like that. And I went in, no slides, nothing to present. I thought I was like having coffee with them. Like absolutely nothing. And it's like, obviously there's like people lined up in the corridor of like, because they're doing like, it's their one meeting a week where they take kind of the whole partnership pitches. So they maybe do like 2 or 3 in a day.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone knows this, but just in case, because there's probably varying degrees of venture knowledge, like it's a pretty typical thing that like, it's usually the last step of investment process, and especially in a traditional fund, you're really pitching like the entire partnership. It's a very high stakes meeting.
Yeah, it's like really high stakes. So there were like other like teams of businesses in the corridor like looking at their slides or kind of things and like reading through it and getting that pitch really nailed. And I just rock up, like, I didn't even have a laptop. I just walk into the room and sit down. I'm like, hi, guys. And sort of proceeded to, and like, I blame Mark a little bit for how poorly that meeting went. Because we'd had one meeting and then he was like, you know, you need a partner meeting. So I went into this partner meeting and basically just told my story. I was like, kind of, this is what I've done. Ran into this problem trying to sell this software kind of around the world. Have an idea for what this thing Paddle could be. And at the time, the thing that I thought Paddle was going to be was a marketplace. So I thought it was going to be like Amazon, but for software, because I assumed that was what was needed. So went in with no mock-ups, no slide deck, no pitch, no numbers of any sort. And like basically just, I was like, yeah, you know Amazon? It's like that, but instead of like physical things, it's all digital stuff. Yeah. And you can browse it and there are reviews and things like that. And they're like, can we get a demo? I was like, it doesn't exist, so no. And for the next, I want to say like 25 minutes of like, I did like a good, I think I had like a 45-minute slot. So I did like 5 minutes introductions, 15 minutes of me spouting a load of shit. And then kind of 25 something minutes of, I'll call them questions. It was basically me getting made fun of for the next 25 minutes of them asking me all these questions that I obviously couldn't answer. And in that meeting, there's a partner at Boulderton. I think he founded Boulderton, a guy called Bernard. And I later found out he founded a software company called Business Objects, and it was the largest software exit in kind of European history. He sold it for $7 billion or something close to it. And in the meeting, I had no idea who this guy was, and he was being, he wasn't being mean, he was being challenging to me, but I was a kid. And I was like, I said something, I got frustrated, and I said something like, Bernard, you don't know what you're talking about. This is not how software is going to be sold in the future. and the whole partnership just like went deadly silent. And then erupted with laughter because nobody had ever kind of like been in this meeting and like stood up to this guy in that way. And so they all, I then had like a really close relationship with all of them afterwards because they were like this kid. But they obviously said, absolutely not, we're not investing in this thing way too early and probably a terrible idea. And then after that, I kind of went out the room. Mark pulled me into, I think, a corridor and was just like, that went shockingly badly. Like he's like, that may be the worst performance I've ever seen. He's like, I've been doing this for 20-something years. And he's like, he's like, you're not going to get them to part with a single penny to put into this thing. But I'll do it myself. To which I was like, what? And he personally wrote a £500,000 check into the business. And that was really the start of the kind of fundraising journey. I had no idea who Mark was either. I didn't even know he was like, had this great reputation in kind of European venture capital and everybody knows him and sort of all this stuff. He joined the board, which was me and him and the other guy called Mark. And we kind of just went from there and sort of Mark sort of like helped guide that journey. And then coincidentally, we ended up then kind of scaling the business and we went to raise a Series A. And Series A was led by Harry Briggs, who was the guy who introduced me to Mark in the first place.
Yeah, love Harry Briggs. So, and now you're 300 people and valued at over $1 billion and close to 100 million in revenue, which are all the public figures that are shared. But before we get to the scale, which will be fun, go back to that moment for a second. How are you feeling? Like you're 18, you're pitching this business, not even just in the Balderton meeting, but as you're pitching customers, are you nervous? Are you scared? Are you excited? Like how is the process when you're running this?
I think it was sort of like I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I think there's like I think it's a little bit dangerous because like you have absolutely no idea what you don't know. So I was just going into these rooms and just stating opinions as if they were facts. So it's like, this is how software is going to be sold, and this is kind of how software companies are going to run their business. And sort of, I had no idea. I felt like every fiber of my being was like, this is absolutely true, but I had no idea. Like really, like looking back on it. So for me, it was like, I don't know, like it
was just your truth.
Yeah, over the last like 3 years, 4 years from like, or even the last 2 years from the moment I kind of like convinced my parents to let me drop out of school to sort of that moment, it had been 2 years of sort of just making it up as I went along. And I always had this desire to figure out how stuff works. So this was just another process of trying to figure out how stuff works and kind of this new thing called venture capital, which I didn't really understand, and trying to figure out how that works. And yeah.
And the software part is interesting too, because you mentioned, I was listening to a podcast you were on recently, and you said something like, when you send someone an email, they don't know how old you are, right? You could be 50, you could be 15. Did you ever have anyone that like met you after and was like, wait a second?
I don't know that I ever met any of those people I emailed.
Yeah,
so like, I think there were a bunch of people, when we did we always struggled to get press for anything that we did at Paddle because the business was so boring. Like we deal with payments and taxes for you. Like until we hit a certain scale, and then people sort of, it became like newsworthy just because of its scale. And I remember getting a couple of these emails from people who I'd emailed when I was like 13, like when that news hit of them being like, holy shit, how are you, like, if you're 22 now, like, you must have been 12 when you were emailing. I'd be like, I was 13.
Yeah. 1 year older makes a big difference.
Give me a break, yeah. In the teens. So, like, it was at that moment, like, really where people, some of these very early people that I was working with, obviously the people I went door to door to sell websites to kind of knew. I think they were probably doing it more out of charity than, like, anything else of, like, how do you say no to the 12, 13-year-old kid on the door who's built you a website and you don't want to pay him £100 for it. Which was the price point, by the way.
It was a steal, honestly, at the time.
Really good.
Like, I feel like Indian takeaway, that's like 5 orders.
Yeah, exactly. And with child labor prices at the time, there was actually really high margin. No, that's recorded. No.
I think you can say that when it's yourself.
Yeah.
I think if you say it for other people, it's good.
Yeah.
And now you're literally at a completely different scale. So you've obviously raised a lot of money. You've grown a team. It's completely different to be a team of 300 than 30. So, what do you think is misunderstood about that journey?
it sounds really fun. It really sucks. It's really wonderful to you meet tons of people, you interview lots of people, you end up hiring lots of people. You get a lot of feedback through that process that hopefully you're doing the right things in terms of building a great company and culture and a place that people want to go to work. And I think that's definitely the most rewarding part of it, is when people come up to you and be like, this is the best job I've ever had, or like, sort of, I was really miserable in my last place and I came here and like I'm doing the same thing, but it's really great. Like that's the best part of it. The worst part of it is everything that breaks. Like everything breaks during almost every one of those inflection points. It happens a couple of times, really mildly, between like 2 people and 30 people. But 30 to 300, everything breaks multiple times, and every time you fix it, it breaks again. Communication, like how you pay people, how you reward people, what is the structure of the org, all of these different things. When you start going internationally, working across time zones and languages and different cultural sort of phenomena of how people work, it's all incredibly tough just to kind of navigate. And I think it's the same time that you're doing that, it's like, it's also, well, at least I can speak for myself, like in the back of my mind, it's like, these are people. Like these are human beings with like families and mortgages and sort of all of these things that kind of sort of your fuck ups become like their life. Like quite frankly.
No,
like,
yeah.
And it's sort of like a lot of like real, it's sort of, pressure's not necessarily the right word, because sort of like, I don't think you build a business if you're not comfortable with pressure. It's more like the accountability of that.
Yeah. The reality, right? And like, do you have any fuck ups that you feel comfortable talking about? Because I don't know. I think
this week or
I think one of the hardest things that founders do that isn't necessarily widely enough talked about is knowing when to listen and when not to. So I think there's a lot of times you get outside counsel, and there's sometimes that you should take that outside counsel and say, somebody has seen this better than me. But also there's a lot of times you shouldn't. And you should say, you know what, I hear that, it was a different context, whatever, and I gotta listen to my gut. Like, have you ever made the right or the wrong decision on that, and any learnings?
Yeah, I think the most interesting ones of those stories are when, or the most sort of gratifying ones of those stories, the ones where someone told you to do something, you did the opposite thing, and it worked out really well. So like we'll start with one of those. The first like real business challenge that we went through at Paddle was the name. And we started the business, and obviously we thought we were building this marketplace. We thought we were building Amazon. There's no paddling down the Amazon metaphor, like as much as I want that to be true. There's not, but we were like, we need a one-word brandable .com like domain name, like because we're building a consumer brand as much as we are building this for other software companies. And bearing in mind, we'd raised £150,000. We purchased the domain name paddle.com for £120,000.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
To which the majority of the advice that we got.
This was the 150 from the other mark.
Yeah.
Was he like, what are you doing?
Yeah, the majority of the advice was like, that's dumb. But like, we had such conviction around this name. This isn't even the funny part of the story. Funny part of the story is 2 weeks later, we're in Mark's office, and sort of it's Harrison, my co-founder, and I, we're sitting at a desk, and a guy walks in, or like the office manager of his office walks in, like, you got a package. We're like, oh, great, package, like post. It was our first post. And we're like, we're a real business now. We have post, people know our address. And it was like a FedEx man, he made a sign for it, and we were like, that's weird. And then we open the envelope, and it's like a cease and desist for using the name Paddle, because there's a company down the street who also had the name Paddle, who had registered the trademark something like 9 days before we bought the domain name. And at the time, it took about 2 weeks for trademark registrations to appear online. So when we did our trademark searches, we ended up having to, we actually raised, this tells you everything you need to know about Mark Evans's blind faith in us. We had to raise the 500K because we had to use 240,000 pounds of it to buy the other company, so that we could continue using the name Paddle, which we'd already spent.
And he knew that.
He didn't know that. It was disclosed.
Yeah. So the ProfitWell was not your real first acquisition. And
no.
Actually, if you look at percentage of the company assets, it was probably, this was your most expensive.
Oh yeah,
domain?
we also had no product, no business, and there was 2 of us. So that was one of those things. And now, today, like actually having the name Paddle, that is paddle.com, and it's sort of one word and very brandable and things like that, has paid off to be like an incredible decision. And actually, you look at similar one-word dictionary, vaguely non-offensive in most places, like one-word domain names, and it's probably like a $4-5 million like just asset in just the name paddle.com. So in that context, it's a steal, but didn't feel like it at the time. But that was one of those instances where we got a bunch of advice and kind of completely ignored it, and it didn't pay off at the time. There was lots of I told you so's in the first 3 weeks, but then now it paid us off. I think the one that we probably experienced, like where we got the piece of advice 6 times, 7 times over the period of about 2 years and didn't follow it and regretted it was, and I think every first-time founder probably goes through this journey, it was like how to structure a sales team and sales comp, and you have BDRs and SDRs and AEs and solution architects and sort of all this stuff. And we were like, Paddle's different. Paddle's unique. Like, we're not like any of those other software companies. So we went through like 6 iterations over 2 years, 3 years of different commercial models and sales team structures and things like that. Today we have BDRs, we have AEs, and we have like, and it's sort of like there is a reason why people have written many books on kind of how to scale sales teams and what works and things like that. And so it was sort of like, it's definitely a mixed bag, because like in both of those instances, I had 98% conviction that this was the right thing to do. In one of them, it eventually really paid off, and in the other, we wasted 2.5 years of trying to scale a sales team. No,
it's really hard. Sometimes you got to touch the burner yourselves, but it's really painful.
And I think that this is probably one of the jobs of investors, and Mark was really good at this sort of back then, kind of when he was sort of like the only real like kind of hands-on kind of institutional investor that we had, was like sort of the character of like a founder often is like, you don't like being told what to do, shocker. It's probably why we can't work for other people. And he sort of like, he absolutely could see the writing on the wall that we were making so many mistakes, but he let us make them because he knew that none of them were catastrophic. Like, I'm sure if we were going to do something really dumb, he would be like, no. But all of these things, you were like, these are lessons that you kind of need to learn along the way, and sort of the business is still going to grow, you're still going to do fine. None of these things are terminal. Go for it, because you'll never make it again. And I think it's a really important like trait of an investor is kind of like, it's also really important to know when to put your foot down and like insist on something, but it's an equally important one to know that somebody in front of you is making a mistake and just let them make it.
I'll also make myself vulnerable on the live stream. I had one of those last week. We try not to be, never try to be prescriptive, right? But then sometimes if you see a mistake that you've seen a number of times before, you're like, yeah, I want to say something, and then you're trying to always figure out the right way to do it. I'm not sure I played it right last week. Anyway, but I did explain the logic to the founder, anyhow, and kind of let them make the call, honestly. So I was conflicted about if I should give the advice or not and how strong to be about it. So I just decided to be open about it. Has this experience changed you?
It's an interesting question. This is where we get like really into the depths of Christian's personality. I don't know that there was a me before this. Like I was 14, 13.
Yeah. And actually, on that one, I was thinking about it because I think in some ways, like there's this, it's in fashion to be a founder, right? And I think people don't realize how hard it is. And there's pros and cons to it being in fashion, but there's like this famous archetype, right? It's like the Peter Thiel, let's take people, drop them out of college and have them be founders. But you know, has there been actually a downside? I mean, there's always been an upside. Most people don't have a unicorn company by the time before they're 30, and I'm sure you've learned just a tremendous amount more than you would have otherwise on a regular journey. But has there also been like a downside personally or otherwise to starting this so early?
Oh, there's tons.
Yeah.
Like I don't know anyone I grew up with, like in terms of, like I left school when I was 16 and then moved away when I was 18 and spent the last sort of decade plus of my life working. The last couple of years have been all right, but like for the 7-8 years before that, working like 18 hours a day, including weekends, and sort of not going back there. So I don't have any like childhood friends. I feel like I recently started doing therapy. And kind of like one of the things that's kind of very apparent to me, like in that is sort of like, there is a part of me that kind of resents having like missed a childhood, and not had some of those experiences and some of those sort of things that people do, and not going to university and not having like a crazy 3 years or sort of whatever. I hear you study as well, but like kind of, I missed out on all that stuff.
Yeah.
And like kind of, it's kind of one of those things that only, when I speak to other founders, it's sort of like only other real founders who can empathize with it. Because everybody else you speak to in like day-to-day life is like, yeah, but you have a company that's worth $1.4 billion and sort of all this stuff, and you're 28. But it's kind of like, actually, there is a big chunk of my life that I feel like I missed out on. Like, it was actually a really interesting the information article about this sort of the other day that interviewed a bunch of kind of people who had went through it, and like the experience, or like the almost like shared experience of all of these people who started businesses when they were really, really young, was almost universally the same. They kind of resented it a little bit for not having a childhood, and like you have to grow up very, very quickly. But when asked, like, would you change anything about it, the universal answer was no. Like, I would absolutely do every part of it again. And the same is true for me.
Well, if it makes you feel better, we all have to go to therapy. I go to therapy. We all have things that we wish we did. But no, it's true. I
probably should have started going like 6 years ago. So it's like, the fact that it's been like a last 3 weeks thing, it's probably
I think it's also, I think people don't realize how hard it, I mean, you work really hard and you do give up a lot. Like I ran a podcast last year with founders who've scaled, and it's a very consistent theme, right? Just the humility, but also just like what it takes from you. And a few people were like, you have to separate your identity from it to try to have some sort of like space or personal life. But the truth is, it's super hard to do that. It is your identity. It is your life in so many ways.
I think if you're a founder who goes along this journey for a long enough period of time, like the common thing that I've seen is in the first year, 2, 3, 4 years, I'm not going to controversially say the only way to be successful, but really kind of pattern matching. The way that most people are successful is there is no distinction between their life and the business's life in those early years. And then you kind of go through this moment in time at some point in the journey. For me, it was probably a couple of years ago, where you're like, actually, like, I probably need to be, like, Christian needs to be just more than paddle. And then you kind of go through this weird kind of very expedited process of growing up and trying to decouple yourself emotionally from the company. But yeah, I think that I think everybody sort of goes through that thing. And then in the period where you're in it, like you are one with the business for that first 3, 4, 5, however many years, like it doesn't feel that way. Like you just realize that when something bad happens, you also feel terrible. But when something good happens, you also feel great. And it sort of is a bit addicting in that way.
Yeah. It's also good to have co-founders for that reason.
Yes.
You also, because of how you started the business, ironically monetized from day one, as we said, which very few people have done in the last 5 years in venture. And in some ways, the way you've thought about it, which is like, if we put something out there, it has to actually have revenue or have value from day one, is very beneficial to people starting companies now. Because I think a lot more of the reality for the next 5 years is going to be like, what are the cash flows of the business? And can you actually monetize it? And how do you really drive it? You still have to grow, but do you have any advice to founders starting with this kind of market backdrop?
I think, I don't know, it's sort of, I think there's a couple of things. I think when you think about the time period in which Paddle was started in 2012, obviously like largest bull run in tech history that we've been a beneficiary of over that time. But in the first like 2-3 years, like the market then looked quite similar to the market now in terms of what did valuations look like, what did a Series A look like. Our Series A was $3 million. Like that's like a pre-seed down the back of the sofa round. Like for the past 2 years, it's been kind of like everybody was raising that because there was so much money kind of floating around. And like valuations back then, like when we raised that round, it was an $8 million valuation that we raised that. It was $3 million on an $8 million valuation. They did really well, by the way.
Yep, I'm sure.
But But so like that, so I guess like the takeaway from that is like it is still possible to like starting with not a lot of capital, especially like institutional capital when you get to that stage. And we were doing about 50,000 a month in revenue when we raised that Series A. And like we kind of managed to raise this seed money like relatively early from a couple of individuals. It wasn't any institutions, and we kind of grew the business to that. And really up until, I want to say 2020, we had raised, I think, a grand total of $25 million. We were a relatively big company for like our fundraising style and how old we were and things like that. It's like really in the last 3 years that we've raised nearly $250 million more money and kind of done a bunch of stuff with it.
And on the raise perspective, it's interesting. I'm gonna keep us honest and just do like 1 or 2 more questions so that we have time for everyone else to ask. But so we could go a lot of places with fundraising. But I think what I'll say is one of the rounds you raised, if you'd raised it, I think 3 months earlier, but you give the timing. One of the rounds you raised, basically you should have waited and you would have got more valuation. And then the next one, had you raised 3 months before, it would have been way overvalued. And had you raised 3 months after, probably wouldn't have been able to raise.
Yeah, so
there's a timing part.
When we raised our Series C, which was $70 million, it was September 2020, which means that we started raising it in about March 2020.
What was happening then?
And I think, I can't quite remember. I have to check the diary of what significant world events happened then. But like, it was still in the period of time where everybody was like, the world is ending.
Yeah.
Like, kind of, we can't go outside, like, sort of.
Oh, funds were like, we're not investing in anything,
no, exactly.
Full stop until foreseeable future.
So actually, like, we were in this weird spot as a company where, like, theoretically, we didn't need to raise any money. But nobody knew what was coming over the horizon. Nobody knew how long this was going to last and things like that. And we were in the second, like, very positive position of like being a huge COVID beneficiary, because we power all of the sales of software and subscriptions and things like that.
And across countries where everyone's now global.
Yeah, and it turns out that people decided to buy a lot of software in 2020. So it was really actually, we were having to raise the money not because we needed the money, but actually because we needed to invest ahead of where we were so that we could keep up with this insane demand. Bearing in mind, I can't remember exactly what revenue we were doing. We were doing tens of millions of dollars a year in revenue. And we grew revenue 30% like in 2 days.
Wow.
So it's 30% more customers, 30% more transactions, 30% more customer support requests, like all of these things. Like it was literally overnight as the lockdown started, and we could see it country by country. So we'd grow 30% in the country the day of the lockdown.
Wow.
So it was that. So that was the backdrop behind us being like, holy crap, we need to go and hire some people, like support people and things like this to just support this demand. So we went out and we went to raise, I think about $50 million initially, and it ended up being 70. And we also had a very strict requirement for that, which was we wanted to raise it from the US because that was where we wanted it to be. And we raised, I can't remember the exact valuation we raised it, but it was like a couple $100 million that we raised that money at. And literally 3 months, 4 months later, companies with worse metrics than us because they'd waited that 3 months were raising at like $1 billion. And then contrast that, so like we were a bit early and we got sort of a little bit kind of like screwed by the market timing.
Yeah, a little haircutted.
Yeah, on that. And then fast forward to last year, we raised $200 million and we closed that $200 million in May of last year. So it was like doing that fundraising process sort of from February through May. And if you remember the direction of those stock market charts at the time that we were doing that, and we raised it at a $1.4 billion valuation. And 3 months earlier, it would have been probably a $3 billion valuation. And maybe 60 days later, it would have been, probably wouldn't have happened at all, to be honest. It probably wouldn't have closed, given like where the market was at. And people are like, don't you wish you'd raised it 3 months earlier? And I was like, no.
Oh yeah, I think either direction would have been just as bad.
Either direction would have been completely terrible for the business. In one direction, like we wouldn't have raised the money. In the other direction, we would have raised the money at such a high valuation that we would have spent the next 3-4 years just trying to grow into it.
And actually any meaningful exit, IPO or otherwise, is like the people who invested at 3 billion now need to make a return, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of pressure. So we'll just go general fundraising advice. You can't really time it, but any advice, what's a good investor actually look like now that you've seen a lot of them? Like how should you choose an investor, and any advice on how to fundraise overall?
Fundraising generally, I think it's far more about the person or people that you are raising from than it is the money itself. I've been very fortunate that kind of everybody who's been involved in Paddle, we've been relatively picky. I think when we raised money from Notion, who led our Series B, they were not the highest valuation kind of that we were offered. It was not the largest amount of money that we were offered for that Series B. We went with them anyway because we felt really confident in kind of them as people and how they were going to help us. So I think people is more important than any of these metrics, because as we've seen, these metrics change very wildly, like month to month almost, depending on the market you're in. Like you shouldn't be optimizing for a thing that can be 60 days later entirely out of your control anyway. Like why are you optimizing for 10% higher valuation to work with people you don't really want to work with, when actually that kind of haircut or increase in valuation is going to happen anyway?
Yeah, the truth is company building is so hard. I think one of the misnomers is people just think that these companies are obvious, right? Like there are companies like an Uber, like there are companies that just take off, but most companies aren't like that. Like the fund I was at in New York before this, there's a company that I joined, and in a minute you'll probably know them when I say the name, but when I joined, the company was like not doing well. It had almost gone bankrupt twice in 6 years. And then it went on to have one of the fastest growing revenue trajectories we've ever seen. And the company's called Noom. It's now like a multi-billion-dollar company in the US, and one of the most wonderful CEOs ever. But I think that it's not always a straightforward path. And I see a lot of first-time founders over-index for like not only valuation, but like how can they help and what introductions can they make. And Mark and I have had this debate because I came from the platform side, and I do think good VCs can actually help founders. But also, to your point, like really the best founders just build, and you can kind of get out of their way and that you don't need to be there. But there is actually this kind of thing in between, which is value-destructive VCs. Mm-hmm. And you can get people on your board and in your company and in your cap table, especially non-professional VCs even more so, but in general, that make your life not pleasant. And so I think actually if you avoid those in either direction, that's the most important thing, because it changes your day-to-day.
It's one of the most interesting like phenomenons is that sort of like actively not bad is a really good outcome. Mm-hmm. Like having somebody who's not terrible, like who's just straight average, like that maybe you kind of like you hear from them every now and then and they don't really add any value, is a better outcome because there are so many worse alternatives where they are detractors to value. They don't let you go through and have those mistakes. So you don't ever learn anything as a founder or a person running a business. Instead, sort of you're running a business by proxy and begrudgingly because sort of somebody's giving you advice that you don't really want to take. So yeah, it's one, it's about the people. Two, I think you can't time it. What's the Warren Buffett quote? Time in the market.
Yeah.
Not timing the market.
Just got to make decisions when you get there.
I think like do the right thing for the business at any given moment in time. Don't necessarily try and predict these things in the future because you'll get it wrong. And I think sort of the only other thing is I think it's very easy as a founder, especially in those sort of slightly later stage rounds. You've raised a Series A, the business is doing really well, you're scaling. It's very easy to get mesmerized by the idea of raising money. Like it turns out that you do all of this work over a short period of time and people buy you really nice dinners and sort of like shower you with compliments, especially if it's kind of competitive. And like that can be a thing that is very alluring to kind of go and chase after. And suddenly you find yourself in this position of not actually building a business, but actually in perpetual fundraising mode. Mm-hmm. And the worst part about it is you quite enjoy it. Like sort of like you get kind of a little bit of a high from kind of going and chasing after kind of going and raising money, and then you realize that isn't what you're here for. Yeah. And you forget to go and build the business.
I think Matt Robbins said the best fundraising advice is just build a good business, right? So easier said than done. We could talk all day, but I feel like these people probably have a lot of questions for you, so I'll turn it over to the audience for questions.
Oh, okay. That'd be great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Christian and Maria. I thought that was, especially as a young person, I thought that was fantastic. And as a young person, I would like to ask, given the fact that you work so much, as any, I guess, successful person would do, and you therefore endured a lot of stress, would you suggest getting a co-founder? And if I may also ask, what are the things that you look at when you recruit people? So I think that's something that you touched upon. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm tempted to make I'm 28, I'm basically bald joke about stress, but I'll resist. I think co-founder is great. Like, it's definitely like a problem shared is a problem halved. I think, and this is coming from somebody who had a great co-founding like journey story in terms of we lived together for the first like 4 or 5 years of building the business. Like, we were kind of spent 18 hours a day working together for nearly 10 years. And sort of, we definitely had a lot of arguments, but we never really had an argument. It's sort of like when you have an argument with a parent or a sibling. Like, it's sort of like, you know that there's this sort of underlying foundation of like, kind of, they're still gonna be there tomorrow. So I think that I got very fortunate in a co-founding journey of like finding that person. It sounds like I'm talking about getting married, which it kind of is.
It is.
But I think that was, so like my experience of having a co-founder was universally positive. And sort of we lent on each other in the hard times, we celebrated together in the good ones. I think it is a huge mixed bag of like people's experiences. You'll speak to another founder, maybe even tonight, and their experience will be, I had the worst co-founder, the whole thing blew up. Now that there's this person who owns 40% of the company who like hasn't done any work, and I feel like I'm working to make them rich. And like all of these sort of outcomes. And there's legal things you can do to protect against that and structures and things like that. But I think I was very, like the story of how I met Harrison was I met him online. We started working together on the invoicing thing as a contractor. We started Paddle, and the first day that we met in person, in real life, was the first day that we had rented a little office for Paddle. Like, it was day one of the company. We'd never met in person before that. And he came into the office and spent the first 23 minutes of me knowing him in person trying to turn his computer on. And I was like, oh, fuck, I've made a really bad decision. But it went like swimmingly after that. But like that could have gone horribly, and I suggest everybody does far more due diligence than I did. That happened to work out because he's incredible and now runs a company called Good Fit.
There's actually some crazy stats about co-founder drama in the first, or exits in the first year. So I think the point is like spend the time to build and get to know each other.
Yeah.
For a meaningful period if you can, or somebody you really know.
Like if you can find a great co-founder you feel really confident in, I would 100% advise you to kind of go and do this journey with someone else. However, it's much better to be a solo founder than it is to have a really bad co-founding relationship, is probably what I would say.
And you also don't always have to make the decision now. You can like get to know someone and have them as an employee, and then they're so valuable that you make them a co-founder, because you wouldn't want to like not have the economics over time, but it's tricky to get right.
And then the second one was about hiring people. What do I look for? Scrappiness, like grit, like sort of it's like the type of people growing up who sort of fell off their bike when they were 3 years old and then immediately got back on the bike. I think I don't know how to kind of articulate that any better, but it's sort of that sort of trait in people, because it's just going to be a perpetual process for the first like 3 or 4 years of getting repeatedly falling off your bike and having to like get back on. So like, especially in very early people, I think that's a really important trait. It's very difficult to measure. And then I would say passion for the idea in early stage, I'm talking, I think passion for the idea or the thing that you're trying to build or the thing that you want to make true in the world is far more important than any like qualification, skill, anything else. Like having people who genuinely want to be here and genuinely want to work on a problem, because they are the only people who can work that 12, 13-hour day. Not that everybody should work 12, 13-hour days, but they're the only people who can work that day and it not feel like work. So I would say optimize for those things early. You obviously then have to bring in skills and experience and all of these things later and later and later as you scale. But optimizing for those, I think, traits up front. And I would say the other thing is, if you are working 10, 12, 8, even 3 hours a day. Like, these are people in probably very small confined rooms or Zoom rooms at this point you have to spend a lot of time with. So, like, optimize for just enjoying the other people. Like, life's too short.
Thank you both. It's been insightful and we've learned a lot. So I have a question about people and growth. So between 30 and 343.
Is that the number?
Yeah, I think it's 343.
Very specific.
I think between those two, just hang on, yeah. Between those two spots, with regards to product and people, what do you think is the most meaty problem you had to deal with when growing the product at scale?
When you say growing the product, do you mean the number of people using the product, or do you mean the breadth and scale of the product? That's another example, actually, of something that was lots of advice that was given that we completely ignored, which was everybody was like, don't focus on increasing the breadth of the product. Don't build feature after feature and things like this onto the product and onto the product so that it's so sprawling and things like that. And we did just that. We launched like 19 different products that all had different names and different landing pages and all this stuff. And of those 19 products, I think maybe 2 exist today. Like, we spent so many cycles building stuff and launching it and having like great tons of traffic and a bunch of votes on Product Hunt and all of this stuff. And we felt really good about it. And then you realize that you have this entirely disparate base of customers who all signed up for like one individual thing, and they have absolutely nothing in common with each other. They have no problems in common with each other. And instead, we then narrowed this down to 1 or 2 like really core things. And sort of from there, now at scale, we add things very consciously on. I would say, and this may be like entirely counterintuitive to, and I think as technical or product people, and I'm sort of technical. If any of our engineering team here, they're probably like laughing. But like, I think there is this this desire, or certainly I had this desire, as you're building product, like the exciting bit is building stuff and then shipping it and then people using it. And actually, you think that there is this almost like causal or correlated relationship between the number of things that you ship and the amount of success that you have, or the amount of revenue you have, or the amount of users you have. And I would actually probably say it's inversely correlated. Like, you would be surprised, there was a period of time after we killed all of those products at Paddle where, much to the kind of, I think, still hatred of our sales team, we didn't ship really any substantial feature for probably 3 years. Like, we made improvements, we made like reports better, we improved security and reliability and performance and all of this stuff. We probably didn't ship a meaty, like one of those things where we could put a landing page up about it for 3 years. And the business probably grew 15x.
Can I ask a related question? Do you think that's true for people too? Because I feel like right now I've seen a lot of companies like raise a lot of money and hire a lot of people. And then I've had like 3 conversations the last 2 weeks where people actually realized that they like ended up going to a much smaller team and actually growing much faster.
Yeah. I think all of this stuff is overhead. Like, not in the traditional sense of overheads, but like every incremental person that you add to the team is an incremental person you have to manage, which is an incremental like piece within the structure of the organization. For every 10 of those people, you have to hire another manager. For every 10 of those people, you have to hire another VP. Like, it's sort of compounds and compounds and compounds. And it becomes all of this organizational infrastructure that you have to manage that fundamentally does slow you down. Like, building that slows you down, running that slows you down. Like, there becomes a point where it's obviously necessary to have all of those things. But the same is true for products. Like, the more things you have to maintain, the slower that you will go on any one of them. The more pieces of the product that you have to market, like if you have £1,000 to market 18 products, you can spend not a lot of money on each product, versus you can plow all of that into one. And I think kind of it's true organizationally, it's true from a product perspective. And I'm not saying that there isn't value in building stuff. There obviously is. And we build tons of stuff. Like, the majority of the company is engineering. But I think it has to be a really conscious decision to take on that responsibility of either more people or more products or resources or anything like that.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And Christian, has been tremendously insightful. Thank you. One of the terms that kept popping up in my head is sort of reality distortion, right? That thing where we founders are chasing dreams, are ignoring some of the warnings and advice that we're given. Would you say that that's accurate? And then to what extent are you cultivating that? Because Paddle is still sort of going on against much bigger players, legacy players, chasing the big dreams. Is there any way in which you consciously distort reality a bit?
Yeah, I think this is sort of one of those things that depend on your perception of it, and almost the outcome, like whether it works or not, determines whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. To some extent, I think, especially to start a business in a space that is wildly competitive, payments may be the most competitive industry of all of them. To do that, I think there has to be a healthy dose of sheer naivety, of you have no idea what you're signing up for, and a probably equal dose of that kind of reality distortion, of kind of create the future, kind of imagine it and then go build it. Because I think if you don't do that, one, it's not as fun, but two, I think that you end up in this, if you're not doing that at some stage, you end up looking sort of outwards at others. And then you'll only be as great as the last thing that you saw someone else do. And I think you have to have this, it is a little bit of arrogance. It is a little bit of kind of, you don't have to be arrogant as a person, but you have to kind of sometimes think a little bit arrogantly in order to believe that sort of, just because no one else has solved this problem, I can. So I think there is an element to that. I think kind of it's somewhere between being a little bit arrogant in the way that you think and just having a vision or a belief of something that you wish to be true, and then just running as fast as you can at trying to make that thing true.
I think the clarity of vision is really important. Somebody the other day told me that that's one of the main things they look for in investing, and there's lots of ways to invest, but they're that the way the person talks about the future is almost like it already exists, right? Which is basically what you did in the Balderton boardroom, intentionally or not.
Yeah, but I think to some extent of a credit to Mark, actually, of being able to unpick kind of what was actually the good idea within Paddle from all of the shit that I was saying. Because if it had been actually, if you'd taken that at face value, we were building Amazon for apps, which we built and we launched and absolutely nobody used. It was actually credit to Mark, in him being actually the thing that you're building is the underlying infrastructure that powers all of that stuff that will be the thing that is valuable. And it was also the thing of, and a lot of investors do this. A lot of investors sort of make, I think, this mistake, because it's a bit like someone bringing their baby into a room and you telling them it's ugly and you should kind of sort of change these things about it. But I think Mark saw that and was like, they need to go build the thing, because they're going to build all this infrastructure anyway, to understand that nobody wants a marketplace, to understand that they want the infrastructure. And I think so many times somebody comes in with this cool idea for something, and an investor's immediate response is, actually, have you thought about just getting rid of that bit, and we could soon sell this to banks, or something like that. And it's sort of it's so discouraging, because you have this idea, and it's you'll still be able to sell it to banks if you let them kind of go on that journey. But it sort of, there has to be this dose of, I think, kind of naivety involved, and just, I think more than anything else, I think companies are almost willed into existence. You can create all the business plans in the world, and it's why every time if you go to a party or a family gathering and you go, yeah, I work in tech, someone goes, I have a great idea for an app. And it's sort of so did 95,000 people had the idea for Uber before Uber, but they were the ones who did it. And I think they willed it into existence, and I think that's what we do as founders.
Did you ever chase a PSP license?
Did you ever chase a PSP license? We thought about it. So we thought about becoming regulated and to doing this stuff. We actually landed on this model where we're a merchant of record. So it actually means that all of the software that's sold through Paddle is sold to us, and then we sell it to someone else. And actually, probably early on we didn't have the confidence in our, like we could absolutely go and get an e-money license or a PSP license today and like be fully compliant, capital requirements and all of that stuff like tomorrow. Early on, like I think we just didn't have the confidence in our ability to go and do that. So, and at the time, everybody that we spoke to actually, investor-wise, told it was our biggest weakness, was like the fact that we didn't have this license and we were the merchant of record and like all of this stuff. And actually today it's our number one thing that the reason that people use Paddle is because not because we don't have a license, but because actually we're the merchant of record and we're responsible for all of these things. So like we considered it at the point at which we probably could have actually realistically gone and done it. It had already been like actually the nature of us not having it was the reason that we were successful.
And there's a lot of hype around AI at the moment. Building like an intelligent routing tool kind of seems like an obvious next step.
Like payment routing.
Yeah. Is that something you would consider or you guys are doing? Or?
We built it. We launched it in 2019. It's called Paddle Pilot. It handles like kind of several $1 billion a year worth of transactions. We don't talk about these things enough. But
There's a few questions there and there, I think, too.
Hi, thank you for joining us. Clarity of vision is really important for both the founder but also for employees to know what they're doing. With the advent of ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion and everything else, how are both of you seeing your business models being disrupted?
What do I think? I think the advent of AI, I think at some point is going to replace a lot of things, and it's replaced probably a lot of processes. I think that right now, AI, and I think this is true for crypto or kind of any of those things, like AI is far more like mature, but is still in a lot of instances a technology looking for a problem. And there are actually plenty of like problems where actually the application of AI does solve the problem, or at least make it more efficient. And I think it's the same argument that people have made for crypto, and it actually just turns out that it's a worse solution to the problem in a lot of instances. I think kind of for us, like we're investing like relatively heavily in AI to just automate or optimize sort of things that we were already doing. I was actually saying kind of just before this, we were having a conversation, and Paddle's been using AI for customer support. So we do all of the underlying support for all of the transactions that come to Paddle as well. So it's like 100 million transactions a year, something like 2 or 3 million customer interactions a year that we have. People kind of wanting a refund or to cancel a subscription or to change a payment method or something like that. We started using AI chatbots for that in 2019. And today, I think about 60% of all of those customer interactions are handled entirely by AI. So I think for us, it's sort of a thing that we've been investing in for a long time. But it becomes, I think with the accessibility of that comes with OpenAI, Stable Diffusion and things like that, I think probably makes it sort of part of the day-to-day of us looking at problems to solve, being like, is there an AI application for this problem that we can use to make it more efficient? Like that initial AI chatbot that we started building kind of 3-4 years ago, like the initial investment for us to get to that point where it was even barely functional, I think we started at like, it could reply to like 5% of tickets, was like $300,000-$400,000. Like we could probably build that thing today for like sort of $500 in an OpenAI account.
Yeah, and on my side, obviously, we're looking at a lot of things that are being disrupted that we might invest in the space. And I actually have done a lot of crypto since 2015 consistently, and I'm still long, but different story, and in specific ways. But I would say that it's always a question, right? Like I've been in crypto since 2015, and in the ICO run-up of 2017, everyone was like, oh my God, VCs are going away. I remember being on a panel with someone like, is the VC market going away? I think the good news is like we always should ask ourselves that question. That keeps you being honest about how to make yourselves better. But I think that truthfully, I feel okay for now. I don't know what the time horizon is. What is it? I think it's the Hemingway quote that is like gradually then suddenly. So one of our partners has a friend who's an artist, and she saw some of the AI artist creations and she started crying. She's like a virtual artist and said like, this is gonna totally disrupt what I do. So I think that's probably going to happen, but at the very earliest stages, the way you'd have crowdfunding, I think that can be replaced pretty easily with AI. And actually a lot of the growth stage rounds where you're making investment decisions based on numbers, a lot of the decision making and like kind of analysis could be done with AI. I think at the end of the day, venture is a very human business, and I think especially in the kind of seed to A rounds, there's so much around like, what is the founder? What do you believe in the vision? I think it'll take a lot longer. It still may happen though. So.
I would sort of add one point to that as well. Like the thing about venture, not that I'm a VC, but like I think the thing about venture is you have to think that a venture capitalist is making a decision at a point in time for a company that has a 7 to 8 year time horizon over which they're either right or wrong. And it's sort of like, we could deploy AI models to go and make investment decisions in early stage companies tomorrow, and we wouldn't find out if it had worked for 7 years. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's probably, and then you also think about where this money comes from, of like, this is entirely untested, like we're gonna go and deploy money based on AI. And you think that like, this is like pension funds. Like this is people's pensions and sort of endowments and of universities and things like that. And it's like, good luck convincing a pension fund to go and put all of their money, which they have a duty to go and protect for all of these people who worked really hard and have a pension, into something that isn't controlled by a human, that you're not going to find out if it works for 7 years. Like, I think that it's the same problem. I think AI is going to augment human decision making in that regard before it replaces it. And it may eventually replace it for sure.
Do you mind if I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Would you give any recommendations to early stage founders on using AI to create early stage startups? So I'm from an accelerator background.
Mm-hmm. Of course you should be using it.
Yeah, just play with it.
I mean, whatever, it depends on what you're solving, right? And if it's actually, I would say, don't do it for the sake of doing it. Like, it's going to be like Web3. The number of people who pretended they didn't like Web3 last year is higher than you'd like. Don't do it for the sake of doing it. Do it if it makes your product better.
I think the only change I would make to that is, as a founder, do it for the sake of doing it. Like, I probably spent way more evenings from 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. over the last, 2 months building random shit, on OpenAI APIs and ChatGPT and everything. Just personally, just because it's fun. And, through the process of doing that, I've come up with, 50 ideas, because you kind of understand how it works and, what are the limitations and where does it say dumb stuff and where does it actually work really well, surprisingly well, that you kind of get to a point where you're like, holy crap, we could actually sort of use this in Paddle in order to either make us more efficient or build products. One of the things that we've actually started working on, or we're starting to work on, is one of the biggest parts of onboarding somebody to Paddle is we have to go and review that product. We have to go and review their website and are they using, is the product that they're saying that it is and the price point, does that match up with the thing that they say they're selling and things like that? Well, that's all just text. And we can classify all of this stuff using OpenAI and things like that. And it's not replacing a human, but it's taking this thing that was an hour-long task and hopefully taking it down to a 10-minute decision-making process. But it's through a lot of those sort of things of just playing with it, people are coming up with these ideas of how we can now apply them to the business or the product or things like that. So encouragement, we can go play with this stuff. And
I think for curiosity and learning, you have to, right? We're doing a whole brand exercise, and actually, if you get it right on ChatGPT was pretty dang good. There was a woman there who had a question I just wanted to call out.
I had a question regarding at what point did you decide that you wanted to fundraise, considering you've talked kind of about your story, and I imagine you saved up a good amount of money by the point you started Paddle. Why did you decide to go the fundraising route rather than investing yourself?
Again, it was sort of, so I think first version of the thing that we were building, I was sort of funding myself. And also I hired somebody to run that previous business, so I didn't want to kind of pillage it of its money and it not kind of be a viable kind of business. So I didn't actually take any money, really any money from that business. But definitely had the ability, didn't need the money, could have funded it myself. I think for me, the real crux of the reason behind that was this idea of, I knew when I started Paddle, because I'd learned a bunch of stuff from the previous business. I'd learned kind of how to build a product, I've learned how to market it, I've learned how to do sales, I've learned all of these things. And it felt like kind of, that was like the training business. Like I'd learned a bunch of things. There were 1,001 things that I would do entirely differently if I did it again, and this was me doing it again. But it was really a case of like when starting Paddle, it was like the goal was always to build a big company. Like the goal was always like this was going to be big. I didn't quite realize it would like go the way that it did and be quite as big. Like my relative understanding of what big was much smaller than we are today. I was like, if we were ever 100 people, like that would be incredibly massive. But it was really that desire of like, I knew I wanted it to be a big business. And I knew that there were things along the way that I was going to encounter that I hadn't encountered before, that I really wanted people in my corner who were going to help me. And it sort of like, and it was that like, you ask for advice, you get money, you ask for money, you get advice. Like, I was asking for advice and then on Twitter, and then this guy was like, do you want 150 grand? And I was like, yeah, great. I was like, at that point I had absolutely less than nothing. Like I had sort of like, again, we've determined that I didn't have a slide deck or anything. This was even like earlier than that. Like we hadn't even registered the company. So for me, that process was like, this guy is going to be financially motivated to help me out, like of kind of whatever these things are. So like that was really the motivation. And then I will say this, of like when trying to make that decision, like when you make the decision for the first time to raise money, it does sort of set you on a path where you are now a business that has raised money. So in all likelihood, you are going to be a business that continues to raise money until you're not, until you're wildly profitable and massive and kind of all these things. But like realistically, if you raise a seed round from someone like Kindred, you are raising a Series A. You are raising a Series B. Like you have chosen a path and now you're on that path, and it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get off of it.
Can I add a perspective on this?
Yeah.
I think the first round, actually, I've talked to a number of founders where like, if you're not sure how quickly you want to grow, and it, like, people forget that venture isn't for everyone. Like somebody called it jet fuel once, right? And so jet fuel is great for rockets, doesn't really work for cars, right? And so like, if you are building something and like, if you build something to $30 million and you didn't raise any money and you sell it for $30 million, I mean, I don't know you, but I don't even have $1 million right now. So that would be great. But I think it depends on what you want to build and the scale of the impact, right? Because if it's something where there's bound to be a few winners and you don't raise money, then you probably have to grow more slowly, and it might be harder to actually then get that market share or actually grow. But if you're raising, it depends on what you're building. If you're building something that like actually can grow more slowly, or it's not a really winner takes all and you can still keep growing at the pace you want, there's a lot of pros and cons when making that decision, but I think it depends on what you want to build and how you want to build it. And I think when you're unsure, if it's a business that could be either or, I tend to tell founders to take the first round where you don't have to decide. Don't take any venture money. Take it from angels who are happy to just have like a 2 or 3x and believe in the vision, and then you can decide how quickly you grow and where the vision goes from there.
I would say that's another thing that sort of someone asked, it might have been you, like kind of how do you decide which investors and kind of things like that along the way, and like kind of optimize the people you want to spend time with, don't take the highest price, like all of that stuff. Also, alignment on expectation of outcome. Like raise money from people who have the same exit scenario size of business in mind as you do. And if you raise from people like Kindred, that's going to mean that they want you to make hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. If you raise from somebody who's been successful in their life and is writing you a 20 grand check, it's much easier to have that conversation of like, this may not end up being that, but if it ends up being a $3 or $4 million business and we end up selling it for $10 million at some point, like, is that an okay outcome for you? And most angel investors will probably be like, yeah, that'd be great. It's like lose money on most of these.
Yeah.
But like an institutional investor, they're going to be like, no, you failed.
Yeah, and it just to your point, it's not even failed. It's just there's a lot of like, if it's a $200 million outcome, it sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. It's absolutely a lot of money. It's just that the power law of venture means that because we have pension funds who invest in us or sovereign wealth funds or whatever. I mean, if someone's pension fund invests in us and we don't return the capital, their retirement isn't what they thought it was, right? So there's like a whole fiduciary duty around that. But you get the winners, 2 or 3 winners return the fund. A third of the companies go completely to zero, and a third have like an okay exit, and you probably 1x your money. And so like you actually need those big outcomes to make up for all the losses. And so it's just the venture model and the structure the way it is. Could there be a better model? Maybe. Should we try and get one? Probably at some point. But I think that the asset class, the way it exists now, that's also why we share upside carry, to be honest. Like part of a huge reason why we do the carry share is that we know that everyone we back is an incredible founder. But just because they're not successful doesn't mean that they didn't work hard. Half the time it's luck, timing of market, whatever. And why should we get the upside of that and the operators don't? And so we want the operators who also fail that we've backed to also get some upside. And so it's just the reality of the venture model, the way it exists.
Could I ask a quick follow-up question?
Go for it.
Yeah. Thank you. How did you decide how much you wanted to raise, or was it kind of like however much they were going to offer, I'll take that?
I took as much as they gave me, to be quite honest.
At every round? No. Yeah? Okay, all right.
No, for the first couple, it was definitely like kind of, it was really whatever I could get. And then it became a little bit more intentional probably when we raised our series, close your ears, C, like when we raised the $60, $70 million round, like we were explicitly going out to raise more than 50. Everything before that was sort of us, like we definitely had a target in mind. I don't know whether we ever hit it. But like, I think probably in the history of Paddle, we always ended up probably raising a little bit less than we thought we were going to, up until we were raising way more than we thought we were going to. And there was a shift in sentiment at some point, probably also known as post-COVID 2021, 2022 craziness, where that flipped for us. I think prior to that, I think that there's an interesting shift that happens in companies from early stage to later stage. And you go from raising money out of necessity, like business needs to stay alive. And really, the amount of money that you raise determines the amount of time that the business stays alive for. So you raise 1.2 million and you're burning $100,000 a month, £100,000 a month, you stay alive for a year. And then at some point in that period of time, you have to go and raise more. You go from raising money out of necessity to raising money out of opportunity. Not opportunity, someone wants to give me money, but opportunity, there are many things in the world that we could go and deploy this money to do in order to grow faster or build a bigger business. And I think that's the switch, like point. And I think kind of early stages sort of really, and I think a lot of investors know this, like you're raising money to stay alive and to figure out if the thing, the idea, the concept that you had genuinely has legs and will work. And that's really what you're trying to convince somebody of. There are some rules of thumb of like how much money people will
at the beginning, it's not tied to revenue because you don't have it usually. So it's tied to dilution.
We did.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
Rarely. But I think the thing to say is you also raised as much as you could in the early stage, but it was a very different market.
Yes.
A lot of people who raised as much as they could in 2021 set themselves up for a shitty next round, quite frankly.
Yep.
If you want to read it, one of the best things that I kept citing people in 2021 is if you Google Founder Collective, which is a firm, the perils of pricing to perfection. There's a really good article on why like raising 5 on 20 is actually not always better than raising like 2.5 on 10, right? It's like there's a huge reality in terms of the valuation you set yourself and what that means for the next round and all of these things. And so I think it's about, but also you don't want to under raise. Like right now, if you're going to go raise a pre-seed round, like there's effectively not much difference between raising $600K and raising like $2 million. So like just go raise $2 million. I think you got to know what the market is at the moment and set yourselves up for a long-term success of raise.
And I think what Ray says, I think what she means is if like you're going out to the people who could write a $600,000 check, i.e. the funds, the early stage investors and people like that, they're the same people who can write a $2 million check.
Probably for the same value, probably for the same dilution is the point.
Exactly.
And actually you might even be viewed as like, because if you don't know the market norms, just talk to founders. That's actually the one thing we should say, always talk to the founders. It might like look less ambitious if you say 600K when everyone else is raising 2 million. So you just want to know what the norms are probably.
Also, you don't want to be the founder who is likely in the position of raising 600K and then 3 months later you realize everything's slightly more expensive than you thought it was and asks for another 600. It's better to just ask for the 1.2 up front.
Two questions. One is, what do you want Paddle to be in 10 years? And the other one, if you could clone yourself and work on something else, what would that be?
That's a fun question. In 10 years, I think bigger. No, I think in 10 years, like we recently reworded our mission for Paddle, which we've done maybe 14 times over the last 10 years. And actually, we made our mission we realized that our mission at Paddle is actually to help other people achieve theirs. I.e., like, we power tens of thousands of software companies. All of those software companies are trying to do something really cool in the world that isn't helping someone with their taxes and taking payments. Like, we have some really cool businesses who are like some stuff that we have one company, I can't remember the name of the company, which is really bad. And they build grain moisture monitoring software for farmers. Like, it monitors the moisture of like crops and grain so that you know when to harvest it at the right time. And like, people are using that product, like farmers are using that product to make sure that their crops don't spoil and they get higher yield and they can pay for their like families and lives and employees and things like that. And it's sort of like, the thing that I get a kick out of with Paddle is not that I think that dealing with Hungarian VAT is the coolest thing in the world. It's absolutely not. But actually, the fact that like that business building that product doesn't have to think about any of this stuff and might be able to spend 20% of their extra time on making that product better, that makes farmers' lives easier, that kind of like, that's why we are here. Like, is sort of, how do we enable these thousands of other people to actually achieve the thing that they want to achieve without having to focus on any of this boring stuff behind the scenes? So really, kind of in 10 years' time, it's sort of like, how do we do that for as many businesses that exist in the world as we possibly can, as one. In terms of, I would love us to be an independent public company, and sort of like not necessarily be acquired or kind of anything like that by someone else. Like, for us to kind of be one of the few like European success stories of, like, we have actually surprisingly few for the maturity of this market. Like, we have Adyen and Spotify and a couple of others who have genuinely been really successful public companies independently and haven't been assumed by kind of these US sort of kind of businesses. So if we could be one of those in 10 years, that's great. If I could clone myself and work on anything else, I'd work on taking a holiday. No, I would probably do something in, like, it's going to sound so boring and cliche. I would probably do something in generative AI. I just think it's fascinating. I think all of the applications of like kind of, we're going to write a blog post for you or something like that are like really boring. And it's sort of like, it's shocking how many very intelligent like AI engineers and minds are going to these really shitty problems that like nobody actually cares about, and they could be going to some things that are far more interesting. I would probably do something in that.
Okay, last question.
Fight.
Thank you. Picking up on your point about European startups versus American, a question for both of you. What's up with Europe? Why are we not turning out those startups that turn into enormous companies?
I could talk about this for hours.
Go for it.
We're like 6 years, 7 years, 10 years behind the US. So we're on a natural kind of curve, like, well, we will get there. I think that I will see if I can find it, actually. I don't know if I should read it out, but Mark actually asked me this question about 3 weeks ago, and I sent him like an email back. And my points were, I think we're behind, like we're just genuinely behind. It's going to take us some time. I think the second is, we have a cultural problem of, in the US, you are celebrated for wanting to start a business, for wanting to be an entrepreneur, for wanting to be successful. In Europe, you're not. Like, tall poppy syndrome is real. We celebrate footballers. We celebrate kind of all of these other things, arts and things like that. I'm not saying those things aren't valuable, they are. But we're not, like, kids aren't looking up to entrepreneurs. Maybe they are in the last sort of 12 or 24 months, where kind of you have like Elon Musk and it sounds really cool because he says stuff that people aren't supposed to say and buys Twitter and does all this stuff. But like, people aren't looking up to entrepreneurs as kids. They're not looking up, like, the idea of the American dream is a really powerful one, because it's like hammered to you as a kid. And it's like, go and make something of yourself and be successful and build. And I think we've got away from celebrating the idea of building things. And that being, like, I feel like there is no more noble pursuit in the world than to kind of try and build something from scratch and solve a problem when you're doing it. And I think we've lost that in Europe. I just don't think we value it as a society. And sort of, I would say the second thing is that I don't think the government cares. Like, we're certainly not from a tax regime perspective, from things like, we can talk about that forever, but like, we don't incentivize it. We think we incentivize it. We have, what, SEIS and things like that. What does that actually engender?
Yeah.
It doesn't engender tech investment. It engenders people who run car dealerships to get a tax break by investing it in their brother's startup who's making an app. Like, it doesn't actually like cause the recycling of capital that causes an environment in which tech companies are successful. So there are a ton of reasons. I think the most important one, because people don't move to countries because of their taxes and start successful companies. I don't think that's actually a problem. People might choose not to start a company in somewhere and move somewhere else. But the real problem, I think, is the cultural attitude we have towards towards business.
Yeah, I would say it's similar, but I think we are it's a moment, right? Like, I came from the US ecosystem, and it was really interesting because the European ecosystem like has a lot of things that are like really coming to bear right now that are phenomenal. Like, you also need, if you need a 300-person company, you need 300 good, talented people, and ideally that have seen something like this before. And like, that senior leadership level is hard to come by if you've never had startups before. And so we actually, 120 unicorns last year. I'm sure some of them are paper unicorns that will go away. But the truth is, we have this, we have this really interesting talent pollination moment that I've been seeing. And also this like belief system where angels are reinvesting, right? You angel, people angel. And most people are angel are not actually trying to make money. They just want to support the ecosystem. And so I think—
I'm also trying to make money.
Yeah, also, both. But it's both. You could make money a lot of ways, by the way. That doesn't lock up your liquidity for 10 years. So I think that I can't tell you how many founders I meet who like literally have made money and like haven't done any of the traditional like, let me keep it and have a yield and have a strategy. They literally just deploy it into angel. I'm like, you should probably
diversify a little bit.
But I think the truth is, we actually are at this really interesting talent moment. But the ecosystem needs a lot of things. You need capital, you need talent, you need exits, you need success stories. But I think the cultural fabric I agree with, but I would take it from a different lens. It's not really to celebrate. I think actually everywhere right now it's cool to be a founder. That's only changed recently.
Until you're successful.
I think the different reason is actually that failure is treated differently.
Yes.
In the US, failure is absolutely encouraged, and here it's different. And also, you can't change the cultural fabric overnight, right? And that's what, like, as an American, it's just like, there's a lot of things wrong with the US. We don't have enough time for that. But like, there's a lot of things that work, and the thing that works is the get shit done, positive can-do attitude. Like, it's just in the bones, right? Yeah. And like, thinking about raising kids, I'm like, how do you give them that? But in Europe, like, you used to do well because you did well in school, and you had a label behind your resume, and like, certain things were encouraged, and those things were typically not risk-taking and failing and going out there and selling something when you had no fucking clue how to do it. Like, that wasn't what was encouraged. And so it's like restarting what's encouraged, and I think that we will get there, but it does take time.
I think the confidence element as well. Like, the idea that, like, I think anybody who went to school in the UK or in Europe, the idea of like show and tell, like, come in to the class with a thing that you like, and then just stand up in front of everyone and tell everybody why it's cool. Like, can you imagine like that happening in this country or in Europe? Like, it's ridiculous. Like, it just wouldn't. It just would be, you'd be laughed at.
But even like basic stuff.
My kids in school didn't work well at all.
Yeah, it's sort of like. But
it's the raising your hand, but it's even like I mean, the UK is a little bit better on this, but like my husband's from Italy. Like, there's no extracurriculars in Italy. You don't have like student council and academic decathlon and a cappella groups. And like, maybe you have a sports team, right? But like, you don't have the same kind of like,
sport as well.
Yeah, you don't have the same like, you don't have the same leadership opportunities. You know, like there's a different cultural fabric, and so it takes a while to get there. But I think we're absolutely on the path to getting there. And we're pre-seed investors. We usually invest when like the company doesn't have a name and it's not on LinkedIn. And like, we see phenomenal talent at all different stages at that stage. So it's absolutely there. But it's a 10-year cycle, so you have to see.
Yeah, I would say, despite all of my things, I am optimistic about. And the biggest thing that I've noticed in the last like 10 years, and probably maybe take the last 5 years of it, because the first 5 years we were a bit of a shit show and nobody wanted to work here anyway. But like in the last 5 years, like our ability, like the amount of people that we are kind of going and interviewing, and they are either in the US or they're in London, but they have moved from the US and they have that background of tech experience. Like they were at one of these companies and they had an exit, and then they wanted to decide to move over to Europe because that sounded like a fun thing to do, and now that talent is actually here because they recognize that, oh, there are some interesting companies there that I could actually go and work for. And I'm not bound geographically to Silicon Valley or New York or like one of these hubs in the US.
The data on that is actually phenomenal. So if you look at, we looked at this last year, and COVID was really helpful for this because a lot of people went home, wherever home was, and there was a lot of people from Europe who had migrated to the US in tech, and they went back. And so if you look at almost every country in Europe, the stats for founders who have had startup experience abroad somewhere and then come back to that country in Europe was almost 50% in every country, which is really high.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you all for coming.
Cool.